The first time I met David's mother properly, sitting stiffly in her front room while she poured coffee with hands that seemed to be evaluating me as carefully as they were pouring, the good china brought out for the occasion, rather than the everyday cups I later learned her family normally used, she asked me exactly 3 questions about my quilting, my canning, and which district I'd been raised in. And I remember leaving that afternoon with the distinct, uncomfortable feeling that I hadn't fully passed whatever quiet test that visit had actually been, though nobody had said anything explicitly enough for me to know exactly where I'd fallen short. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why my future mother-in-law had genuine reservations about me early in my courtship with David, what specifically concerned her, and what it actually took over the better part of a year to finally earn her full approval. If you've watched my other videos, you know I'm Rebecca, and you know David and I eventually married and even lived with his parents for several months afterward. What I haven't told you is how close that living arrangement came to not happening at all, because his mother, Naomi, wasn't initially convinced I was the right match for her son. The first issue was simply where I'd been raised. My home district, though still solidly old order, followed a handful of practices slightly different from David's. Small things, really. The specific way we hung laundry, a slightly different style of head covering, a few minor allowances around certain tools that his own district didn't permit, even something as small as the particular hymn tunes used most often during our Sunday services. None of these differences were doctrinal in any serious sense, but in a community where consistency matters deeply, even small variations can raise quiet questions about whether someone raised slightly differently will adjust smoothly to a new household's exact rhythm. Naomi, I learned much later, had specifically worried whether I'd been raised with different enough habits that friction would be inevitable once David and I were living under her roof, a concern I understood far better once I became a mother-in-law watching my own son's choices decades later, though I certainly didn't understand it as clearly at 20. The second issue, and the one that stung more at the time, involved my quilting. Naomi was known throughout our broader community for exceptionally fine needlework, patterns passed down through her own mother, stitches so even they barely looked handmade at all, work good enough that other women sometimes asked to borrow her patterns for their own daughters' quilts. During that first visit, she'd asked, seemingly casually, whether I'd bring a piece of my own work along sometime for her to see. When I finally did, several weeks later, nervously handing over a quilt square I'd worked hard on the night before, my fingers still slightly sore from unpicking and restitching one corner 3 separate times, I watched her expression carefully as she examined it, turning it over slowly in her hands near the window light. Though she said something politely encouraging out loud, I could tell, even as an anxious 20-year-old desperate for her approval, that my stitches hadn't impressed her the way I'd hoped they would. The canning question came up more directly during a visit that same summer, when Naomi asked plainly, while we shelled beans together on her porch, whether I'd ever put up vegetables entirely on my own, without my mother's guidance nearby. I hadn't, not really, having always worked alongside my mother and sisters, rather than managing an entire pantry's worth of preserving independently, always the one following instructions rather than giving them. I remember her expression shifting slightly at my honest answer, a small, controlled disappointment that she tried not to show, but that I noticed anyway, having spent months by that point carefully watching for exactly this kind of reaction from her. I found out from David, months into our engagement, sitting together on his parents' porch swing one quiet evening after the younger children had gone to bed, that his mother had voiced real concern to his father privately, wondering aloud whether I'd genuinely be prepared for the practical demands of running a household the way she expected a wife in their family to manage one. It wasn't cruelty on her part. It came from real pride in how she'd run her own home for over 2 decades, keeping her own mother's exacting standards alive in every corner of it, and a genuine worry that her son deserved a wife capable of meeting that same exacting standard, rather than someone who might struggle to keep up with it. I remember feeling genuinely defeated when David finally told me all of this, wondering whether any amount of effort on my part could actually change an opinion that had apparently already formed so clearly in his mother's mind. But David, to his credit, encouraged me to simply keep showing up honestly, rather than trying to perform some exaggerated version of domestic perfection I didn't actually possess yet. So that's exactly what I did. If you're wondering what actually changed Naomi's mind, stay with me, because it wasn't any single dramatic moment, but a specific harvest season that finally shifted everything between us. The following autumn, during canning season, I asked Naomi directly if she'd be willing to teach me properly, rather than simply hoping I'd figure it out through trial and error on my own before the wedding. I remember standing in her kitchen doorway, working up the courage to ask, half expecting another polite but distant response, and pausing myself for a long moment before finally getting the words out. She paused too, clearly surprised by the direct request, before agreeing, and over the following weeks we spent entire afternoons together in her kitchen, jars steaming on the stove, the whole house smelling like tomatoes and vinegar and dill, her patiently correcting my technique without ever making me feel foolish for not already knowing it. Something shifted between us during those long afternoons, less about the actual canning itself, and more about her watching me genuinely try, ask real questions, burn my fingers more than once and keep going anyway, and take her correction seriously, rather than pretending I already knew everything a future daughter-in-law was supposed to know. By the time that harvest season ended, Naomi had started speaking to me with a warmth that hadn't existed during those early, careful visits, teaching me her own mother's specific quilting stitches without me ever having to ask, sharing small stories about David as a child while we worked side by side, stories about a stubborn little boy who apparently hated wearing shoes even in winter. I remember the exact moment I finally felt fully accepted, watching her hand me a jar of her own carefully preserved peaches to take home at the end of one particularly long afternoon, something she'd apparently never done for anyone outside her immediate family before, according to David, who seemed almost as surprised as I was when I told him about it later that evening. Looking back on that entire year now, I don't think Naomi's initial hesitation was unfair, even though it stung at the time. She simply wanted to know, honestly, whether I was someone willing to genuinely learn and grow into the role I was preparing to take on, rather than someone hoping charm or good intentions alone would be enough to carry me through decades of running a household the way she'd spent her own life carefully building. What actually won her over wasn't pretending I already had every skill she valued. It was showing up honestly, admitting what I didn't yet know, and putting in real effort to learn it properly from her directly, week after week, jar after jar, stitch after uneven stitch. Naomi and I are close now, genuinely close, in a way I don't think either of us expected during those first careful, evaluating visits all those years ago. She still teases me occasionally about that first quilt square I brought her, the one with slightly uneven stitches I was so nervous about, and I still remind her that she kept it anyway, tucked away in a drawer somewhere, evidence, I like to think, that she saw something worth investing in even during the season she wasn't entirely sure about me yet. These days, when I visit, she pulls out her good china without a second thought, and I no longer feel like I'm being quietly evaluated the moment I walk through her door, just welcomed the way I'd always hoped I eventually would be. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to earn someone's approval slowly, through consistent effort rather than any single conversation, someone whose opinion genuinely mattered to you? I'd genuinely like to hear how that went for you.